He had never been particularly sentimental about the layout of his apartment, never obsessed over angles or symmetry or the precise positioning of furniture the way some people did, but he noticed things, quietly, intuitively, like a man who may not know the name of every constellation, yet can still feel when one star has disappeared from the sky. So when he began to notice that the chair in the hallway, an old wooden piece with a cracked spindle back that he used mostly to catch jackets and bags, seemed to sit a few centimeters further from the wall each time he returned home, he did not panic, did not jump to conclusions, did not allow his thoughts to spiral. Instead, he simply measured. Not with a ruler or tape, but with the soft geometry of habit, how he moved past it, how it brushed against his knee, how his shoulder now passed it closer than it did the week before. At first, it was easy to dismiss, buildings settled, floors shifted, perhaps he had bumped it in passing, or the weight of his coat had pulled it subtly forward. But then he began to notice other things. A glass on the counter turned 90 degrees. A book on the shelf that now rested at a slant, though he remembered straightening it days earlier. A lamp in the living room angled slightly inward, as though it had been re-aimed to watch the hallway rather than illuminate the far corner. Each change was minor, nearly imperceptible in isolation, but as the days passed, they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. Things were not just moving, they were advancing, and always in the same direction, toward the bedroom. He lived alone. The locks were never broken. There were no signs of entry, no windows ajar, no hidden passage that he could find, and no sounds at night to suggest intrusion. Still, he began to photograph the apartment each morning before leaving, wide shots, close-ups, overlapping angles, so that he could compare, objectively, the state of the space upon his return. And each evening, when he flipped through the photos with the dull glow of the hallway light humming behind him, he found at least one new discrepancy, one subtle adjustment, one motion without motion that suggested something had been present, something deliberate, and something patient. The hallway chair had moved half a meter across a week. The lamp now cast its glow directly onto his bedroom door. He began checking the closets compulsively, opening and closing them in quick succession, as though catching a breath in motion, but they were always empty, nothing but linen, forgotten boxes, and the whisper of air displaced by his own paranoia. He started setting traps, in his own quiet way, a hair placed across the dresser drawer to detect opening, a dab of lotion on the doorknob to see if it would smear, a light layer of flour across the hallway floor to trace steps. The results were inconsistent, sometimes nothing, sometimes strange. Once, the flower was undisturbed. Another time it had been carefully swept into a neat half-moon curve, like the edge of a bare foot turning softly toward the bedroom. And always, always the objects were nearer, not many, not all at once, but just enough to keep the progression alive. A bookend from the living room shelf found resting on the hallway floor. A spoon from the drawer now on the edge of the nightstand. A cushion from the sofa sitting squarely on the hallway tiles, as if placed as a marker or a pause. He began to dread unlocking the door. Not because of what might be inside, but because he knew the space would have changed again, not broken, not violated, but altered, just slightly, like someone had reached into a memory and tilted one detail off axis. And with each return, he felt the apartment watching, not through sight, but through arrangement, through suggestion, as if the very layout of things had begun to whisper a silent language he was only now learning to interpret. Not a warning. Not a threat. Just a slow, quiet approach. Toward the bedroom. He began leaving lights on in the hallway when he left the apartment, not because he thought it would prevent anything from happening, but because he hoped that illumination might somehow reveal what the dark seemed so willing to conceal, as if light itself could slow the process, could pin the room in place, could make the approaching steps hesitate just long enough for him to breathe again. But the light didn't help. If anything, it only made the changes more obvious. The chair in the hallway no longer merely shifted its angle or crept forward, it was now aligned directly with the bedroom door, its back facing the hallway entrance as though someone had been sitting there, waiting, watching, and then stood up without moving the seat back an inch. The coffee table was now flush against the wall, he never leaned it on. The lamp had been unplugged, not knocked loose, but cleanly removed and set precisely beside the outlet, its cord coiled, as if someone had prepared the space for silence. He noticed, too, that the kitchen had grown colder, not in temperature but in tone, as if the warmth of the place had been siphoned off, drawers slightly open that he swore he had closed, cupboard doors ajar by millimeters, handles not quite facing the same direction as the day before. The angles no longer aligned. The space was distorting by degrees, too small to measure but too consistent to deny. Only the bedroom remained untouched, pristine, unchanged, the bed always made exactly as he left it, the blinds undisturbed, the corners sharp. At first this brought him comfort, a belief that maybe whatever was moving through the apartment had boundaries, limits, places it could not cross. But comfort faded as soon as he understood the inverse truth. The bedroom was not being spared, it was being preserved. Everything else was in motion toward it. The objects weren't shifting aimlessly, they were orbiting, aligning, like pieces of a puzzle being quietly slid into place without his consent. And he could feel it, not just in the movement, but in the atmosphere itself, which now pressed against him with a subtle density the moment he crossed the threshold of his home, as if he had to push through something just to enter, as if the air itself was forming around him with quiet, deliberate resistance. He began staying out later, sitting in the park until the lights shut off and the cold soaked into his bones. He scrolled aimlessly through his phone in cafes until they closed, watched other people's lives move freely while he imagined his own apartment shifting behind him, rearranging itself in his absence like a stage being reset between acts. But eventually, inevitably, he returned, not because he wanted to, but because some part of him feared what might happen if he didn't witness each change as it came. What if the final shift occurred while he wasn't watching? What if the thing, or the moment, or the silence that had been crawling through his home finally arrived, and he missed it? Then came the night he returned home and found the bedroom door closed. He had never closed it. Not once, not in the years he'd lived there. It was always open, always visible from the hallway, a soft rectangle of familiarity beyond the frame of the threshold. But now it stood shut, not slammed, not locked, just firmly, perfectly sealed. He stood in the hallway for a long time, the air around him still, almost too still, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. And then he noticed it, every single object in the apartment had stopped moving.